We're glad to have you back. Now, the rate at which inflation has been accelerating in the country has been a major source of concern for Nigerians, but more so for the Central Bank of Nigeria. As such, the Apex Bank has adopted different measures to tame the surge in inflation, which hits a 17-year high of 21.47% for the month of November. Some of the latest steps taken by the monetary authorities to address the challenges were the redesigning of the Naira notes and introduction of new cash withdrawal limits. Both monetary policies have drawn mixed reactions, as some Nigerians say they are uncertain about the impacts it would have on them in the long run. Let's discuss these issues, and I introduced him earlier. He's an economist and tax manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mr. Abiodun Kayode Ali. Yes, I stayed so much on that. Abiodun Kayode Ali. Thank you so much for your time. It's good to have you in the studio as usual.
Thank you for having me today.
I wouldn't say I would ask you what you were expecting for inflation, because obviously there wasn't going to be a decline with what we've seen in recent times. But we've seen this hike now, 21.47%. I'm saying it that we might end this year close to 22%. What does that mean for us?
Okay, so you're quite right. It's been increasing. Albeit at a decelerated level this point in time. Well, yes, I will expect an increase even in the month of December, but probably not necessarily up to the 22%, but might be close. And if you look at it from the beginning of this year, we started in January, I think somewhere within the range of 15%. That was the headline inflation, with food somewhere around 17%, right? But what I've noticed was that between January to March, the increase was going at a decelerated level. But by the time we got to April, we moved from 16% to 17%. It was now going at a 1% increase, 17 to 18, 18 to 19, between April to August, right? And these are as a result of external challenges that we've been seeing, right? Exogenous shocks that we've been seeing, right? But by the time we got into, and that was when in May, if you remember, that was when the CBN took that stance of actually tightening its policy rate. And from August, we've seen it move at a more decelerated level. So what does it mean for people? I think generally inflation isn't something good. Price levels is something that the whole world is trying to kick against, is trying to guard against in terms of price stability. Advanced economies, developing economies, all tightening interest rates. The question just is that do we have the same structural issues that they have? In their own economy, you would see the impact of their own tightening on inflation, because in the UK, in the United States, in the Eurozone, you've seen a deceleration in you've seen a decrease a decrease in their inflation, right? Yeah. I think the United States posted something around 7.1%, right? But in Nigeria, we've actually, in fact, it was quite interesting when I realized that in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Zambia, Ghana were the only countries that actually experienced an increase for the month of November. Ghana's one is currently at 50% from 40%, right? And Nigeria, we've also increased, though at a decelerated level. What does this mean for people? Generally, it's reducing the purchasing power. It erodes the purchasing power. That's what inflation does, right? If you think about it, no one likes experiencing this, because it simply means that the money you would take to the market to purchase an item, a basket of goods, that same amount which you used in the previous months or in previous years, you can't use that same amount to purchase those same goods. Yeah. And guess what? Salaries are not increasing as much as you would think it is. Even from 2019, one interesting point is that in 2019, when President Buhari signed the new minimum wage of 30,000 naira, a lot of states have even struggled to pay that new minimum wage, right? A lot of states have struggled to pay it. And if you bring that 30,000 to these current times, hardly can you, it's like that 30,000 is even competing with a bag of rice, right? So food prices are actually increasing, and the reasons that have been alluded to by the National Bureau of Statistics are still the same things regarding logistics issues, regarding the cost of diesel, right? And also issues regarding the flooding. And to some extent, we are getting towards the festive season, right? So there is also the festive induced demand of people trying to get things ahead of time. Right, so a lot of people are actually struggling, and like the World Bank had predicted right from the beginning of this year, the inflation is simply going to throw a lot of people into poverty. The World Bank forecasted that for the first 10 months, about 5 million people had been thrown into poverty. That 5 million people, you are adding it to the 91 million existing 91 million existing people that we had
Yeah.
who were actually below the poverty line. And what is even this poverty line we're talking about? We're looking at $1.90 per day. And if you convert it to monetary times using the parallel market rate, you're looking at something of 1,400 naira. Ask yourself, what can 1,400 naira do to you or do for you in these current times? By the time you transport yourself from beggar to the island, you've actually exhausted that money, right? So it's really shocking, and it's really worrying. And do I see things getting any better within the short space of time? Well, I guess only time can tell, really.
Time can tell. Food inflation also rose 24.13% from 23.72%. A lot of issues around that, the effect of floodings and all of that. Have we started to feel all of that? And if we get into that, what are we likely to see? The CBN maintains that all interventions are still very, very impactful. That's what they're saying.
Also, the honest truth is that interventions, but how many people are even getting those interventions, right? We've heard a lot of people come out to discuss. I think there was a recent presentation with respect to farmers. They had a presentation somewhere in Abuja recently, and what they've said is that most of those interventions, about 50%, doesn't actually get to them, right? Some do get to their farmers, actually do get some of them, but not all of them get those interventions from the central bank. That's one thing. Then if you look at it also, it's actually the farms, right? The farms of a lot of people who probably don't even have access to these funds, right? The farms of a lot of people have been destroyed by the impact of that flooding. And apart from that, another reason for the increase in the food, in the price of food that you see also has to do with the logistics concerns, right? So by the time you look at it, right from the farms up till the market, right, you have to consider the logistics with respect to the supply right down. And if you look at it, the roads were also impacted during that period of the flooding from the Lagos Dam, right? So the roads were impacted. All these things, the cost of diesel as well, right, which is used in transporting most of these food items. Diesel prices are still high, right? So all these things are being factored into into the food inflation. And like, if you consider it, food is actually the item that most individuals actually spend their resources on, food and transport, right? So a lot of people can't, they just can't afford these things, right? So the food inflation, apart from CBN having its intervention, I think we also need more intervention, especially with respect to our farming practices, right? Most of our farming practices are still at the subsistence level, right? A lot of awareness, a lot of support needs to be done for these rural farmers on how they can be more efficient in terms of crop production. So I think all these things are actually quite important, right? So that's what I just simply say. It's not just the CBN's intervention that will do the work, but I think a lot more needs to be done in terms of supporting them with respect to knowledge on how they can be more efficient in farming, and also those logistics issues, which are very important, because, like I said, a lot of this produce, right? A lot of this produce that we see, a huge chunk of them actually get damaged on the way. Storage, preservation, issues. All these things, they're quite key.
Yeah, very key if we really need to get the best from the agricultural space. Losses and all of this. Well, let's move into something that is also, of course, topical, and the central bank is also thinking that is one of the ways to maybe rein in inflation, reduce money in circulation. We don't know which is which, but a lot of discussions and submissions from analysts and economists like you. So your view will be very important at this point. The cashless policies, that's what I would call it, because we're reducing it to as much as 20,000 and 100,000, 100,000 for week individual and 500,000 for companies. But where I'm going is, do you think that this would actually help the central bank to gather all of the monies out there? Because the percentage of money that has even come back into the vault is not as much as what is expected. I think around 3 trillion naira is what they're looking at. I don't know where they are at the moment, but as the last check, I'm not sure it's more than 1 trillion naira.
You're quite right. So the CBN governor, Governor Emefiele, actually did say that a lot of money is in circulation, right? And he said out of the 3.2 trillion that is actually out, we have about 2.8 trillion outside bank vaults, right? So I think the policy actually is quite good. The policy is quite good in terms of trying to have its impact. So the Monetary Policy Committee, they've actually been taking a lot of steps in order to rein in on inflation. But the thing is, how potent are those steps? And in trying to ensure that there is that potency, there is that efficiency in whatever steps or measures they take on inflation, they have to do what they are doing currently. Because if most of these monies are actually out of the vault of the deposit money banks, they really won't be able to achieve their impact. But one thing you also want to think about is does the redesign of the currency, and I know these are questions that have been asked, does it actually help to rein in on inflation, which is currently at 23%, right, 23.4%? Does it actually rein in on inflation? So the thing is 21.47%. Sorry. Please. Yeah. So the thing is, if you look at what are the major drivers of inflation, about 70% of that is caused by exchange rate pass-through effect, right? Nigeria being an import-dependent country. So these are the key things, the major things that is actually responsible for inflation. Then the next thing we look at has to do with diesel, right? Diesel and fuel. Then if you want to look at the impact of money supply, it's somewhere within the range of 5%. Right, so that money supply is not really the key thing, and that's why I listened to your report, the news report, where you talked about Dr. Muda Yusuf trying to explain that it's
because
not necessarily
so that they don't tighten it anymore. Because
exactly.
The CBN might want to tighten. The central bank governor said he will continue to increase rates if inflation continues to go the other way.
Yeah, and he was asked at the last Monetary Policy Committee, and he was even told, and he himself alluded to the fact that in truth, the problem behind the inflation is not actually as a result of credits in the economy. No, it's more of a structural thing, a supply thing, productivity, and which is exactly what Dr. Muda Yusuf also said, right? So it's not necessarily that this is going to curb inflation. What you've simply seen, what you've simply done by the redesign, it has its own benefits. You can't take that out. First of its benefits is that it has the benefits in terms of records, in terms of tracking, right? So you can track the volume of money in the system, and in terms of security as well, right? So most of the activities that are going on in the black economy, right? You can actually track it, right? Then also, if you look at it in terms of inclusiveness, right? Financial inclusiveness, CBN wants to achieve that target of 80%, right? You can achieve all this, inclusiveness, security, currency in circulation, and being able to track these things. You can achieve all this. And to some extent, the government can even use it to monitor tax compliance, right? You can use it to identify businesses who are probably not in the tax net. You can use it as a means to bring them into the tax net when you see these transactions. So they have their own positives. But with respect to inflation, can it actually rein in inflation? I don't think so, not necessarily, because like I said, it's the impact of currency in circulation and inflation isn't that much. That's number one. Then apart from that, you also need to, there's also this point I've seen, I've started seeing comments concerning the new Naira notes.
Yes.
Right? And I've seen that some people are even wary of it, right? So there needs to be more enlightenment. I've seen people being interviewed saying things like they really don't trust if this money is original, right? So I think there needs to be a lot of enlightenment to the rural community, right? So a lot of people need to be enlightened more about this. Then there's also something I worry about. And that thing is, it might get to a particular point in time whereby people will begin to even consider the cost of trying to change your old notes for the new ones. And if you consider that cost, you don't want to be the one incurring the cost of transporting yourself to the bank to change it when you are running out of time. There's a time limit, right? So I think a lot of people might get to a point whereby they won't even be accepting the old currencies, even though it's still legal tender up to the 31st of January, right? So all these are other things that the CBN needs to put in place, consider in carrying out this policy. Would it rein on inflation? I really don't think so.
But talking about the rural areas now and our infrastructure generally, to promote seamless online transactions, which many will complain about. I've had issues before now. It's better than it used to be, but people still have issues when you talk about transactions, transfers, point of sale machines and all of that, where people still have to stay weeks and months before they get their monies back. So don't you think that we need to address some of these challenges before we can start talking about making our economy as open as the likes of the M-Pesa in Kenya and what is happening with their online banking and transactions? Don't you think that a lot of work, we still need to work around our structure, our system to make that work?
I do agree with you. So I think one thing we've done more often in Nigeria is that we've taken out policies without actually looking at the platform to actually enable these policies work. Right. So we've done that a lot of times. If you remember when the border closure took place, I think sometime around August 2019, and even when the FX restriction, the policy came, I think sometime around 2015, if I still remember right. So we took all these policies without even looking at, do we have the system, the environment that can accommodate these policies? The policies in themselves are good. I quite agree with you with respect to technology, because if you're talking about financial inclusion, one key thing that is important has to do with network, has to do with technology, has to do with that enabling environment. Like you rightly said, a lot of business dealers, right? They deal with cash. They deal with high volumes of cash. Will they have that technology to allow you do a transfer? I mean, if you go to a retail supermarket, I'm sure you've seen at some point in time they tell you that, oh, you have to wait.
They have to get a
confirmation before you actually pack your goods, right? And it actually takes it takes a lot of time, right?
So at times it doesn't even come.
Exactly.
And you might be forced to say you have to pay. No, we've not gotten it. I've been debited, and the argument starts.
In fact, it even gets more interesting at the point where they now tell you that at some certain banks, you can't do transfer if you are using these certain banks, right? Which kind of complicates issues, right? So I think a lot needs to be done with respect to working hand in hand with the telcos, right? The telecom companies, such that they ensure that there is that enabling environment so that you can easily process transactions seamlessly, right? Then there needs to be a lot of enlightenment. We are here in the city, we are discussing this, but how much people there in the rural communities are able to understand these issues, right? So I think it's something that it's quite sensitive, right? And I appreciate what the CBN governor said with respect to it being a kind of trial thing, whereby they will be making adjustment as time goes by. But I just hope it won't be too late, right? And it won't get to a particular point in time whereby it will now look like an action that one will begin to regret, right? But I just believe that it's important they work hand in hand with the telcos at this point in time.
Very important one there. So wrapping up our discussion today, banks should also load 200 nairas. That is the directive into the ATMs. I think it's all to just reduce money in circulation. It's the same thing that we've been talking about. But what is the outlook now? It's the end of the year. Yes, few days we can actually say to the end of 2022, and we are moving to an election year. What are your projections? What is the outlook for you generally?
Okay, so for me generally, if you look at this, if you even consider the inflationary impact, right, a lot of people won't even want to spend, right? And a lot of people, because of the festive season, right, a lot of people would actually be buying things in bulk, right? So in such a way that they can actually reduce their cost. That's what I see. So inflation definitely, it will increase, right? It will increase, and the reason why it will increase marginally also will be because of the transport effect, this PMS, right? You know, a lot of people make use of fuel, right, for their businesses, and the costs have gone up during this period in time. I think I heard this morning in Kaduna that it's selling somewhere within the range of 300 naira per liter.
Even in Lagos, some places it's 250.
Exactly, right. And if you look at it, it's also impacting on manpower, on productivity, right? Because a lot of people would spend their man hours queuing for fuel, right? So from what I see, I see two things. The first thing I see is that there is definitely going to be inflation, because all the impact of this high cost of fuel, it will feed into transport.
Aviation, fuel, hiking,
it's going to feed into it. And apart from feeding into it, it's going to raise cost of products, right? That's one thing, right? Then in terms of also our GDP, we might not, and if you think about it, the World Bank has actually reduced its forecast from 3.8% to 3.1%. So I see a small contraction also taking place. I don't think we'll do 3%, but I still think we'll do 2% for the fourth quarter. But for the full year, yes, we might hit the 3%, right? And that's because of the good times we've had in the Q1 and the Q2. So for the rest of this year, for the Yuletide season, I see prices actually going up. And my hope and my expectation is that the CBN would release a lot of these monies out so that people can actually access it. And I hope also that the CBN will do a lot of education so people can accept it. Right, so these are the things I see before the end of
brilliant stuff there. Interesting chart as usual with Mr. Abiodun Kayode Ali there. He's an economist and tax manager, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you so much. Do enjoy your weekend.
I thank you, you too.
Yeah.